Hey sophomores, welcome to today's screencast. What we're going to do today is take the information that you just learned from your Cuban Missile Crisis screencast, and you're going to apply it to what you have read so far from The Art of War, primarily the graphic novel and then the chapter 3 of the Giles translation. And I'm going to just walk you through what it's going to look like for you when you're doing this with your own battle. So for today, just pretend that the Cuban Missile Crisis is your battle, and I'm going to walk you through what you're going to do to kind of analyze the art of war and then apply it to your battle. Okay, first let's create a little context. So we're in week 10. This is Schoology. You've read the explanation of this week's work. You've seen the 3 different versions of the text, which are in every single week. And then you have hopefully read chapter 3 of this Giles translation before you're here. If not, I would consider pausing this and going back and reading chapter 3 first. You don't have to have read 6 and 10, but 3 is pretty important for the concepts that we're going to be explaining and talking about here in this screencast today. And then you hopefully have watched this Cuban Missile Crisis screencast. It's about 15 minutes and it gives you the background you need. And so we are here on the Cuban Missile Crisis practice discussion. So we're inside of that document right now where you have already watched the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now I'm just going to show you the process of how to take the information that you know from your battle, which right now is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how to apply the strategies from Sun Tzu's Art of War. I have created this document that's going to help me as a thinker and as a writer to organize my ideas. You have one for you as well. Your note sheet is right here, 10.08, and it's Art of War and Any Battle note sheet, so I just provided that for you. So if you like what you're seeing today, then you can go ahead and use that one, which will become your own copy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load all my Cuban Missile Crisis facts. So I'm going to jot all of that down here. And then I'm going to jot down any applicable Art of War facts, any facts that I've read so far from the Art of War that seem to have some kind of relevance to what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then right here, there's a space for me to start outlining my body paragraphs. And specifically, we're talking about body paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, where you will take a strategy from the Art of War, and then you'll apply it for an entire paragraph to your battle. So let me show you what I did there. Okay, so like I said, my first step was to just brainstorm everything I know from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so for me, that looks about that long. Okay, so I have a couple of bullet points, things like the Soviet Union brought missiles and troops to Cuba, and then the CIA noticed those missiles. And then the US blockaded or quarantined ships that were entering Cuba from the USSR. Then negotiations started. And the US then brought evidence to the UN, but the Soviets actually evaded all of their questions during that UN situation. Next, the US then considered their military response, but they resisted a military response due to the fear of nuclear war. Remember, at this time during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, really the United States was quite terrified that the USSR was going to create a nuclear launch of missiles and attack the United States. It was a very tense time. So they resisted waging war because this fear was, pretty genuine. At that point, Khrushchev then requested that the US remove their missiles from Turkey, which was complicated by a situation going on with NATO. But the US did promise not to invade Cuba if the missiles and troops were then removed. So, USSR had on the table this idea of removing the US's missiles from Turkey, and the US was like, okay, but what we really want is you to get out of Cuba, so we're going to promise not to invade if you'll leave all of the stuff if you'll leave Cuba, basically. All right, so then the deal was made. Khrushchev did not ever reveal that the deal in Turkey was a piece of all of this. So the US ended up looking like the winner, but actually both sides really had to give something up to get out of this without war. And so globally, they did broadcast the outcome. They just didn't include the idea that Turkey was a piece of what the US gave up. They just announced kind of that they were leaving Cuba. Okay, so those are my facts. Now, my next move is to consider what I know of the strategies from Art of War and which of my strategies that I know from the Art of War will apply to this Cuban Missile Crisis. That's my next move intellectually. Okay, so having done that, you'll see that I come up with this many strategies from the Art of War that I think apply to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, win without fighting, and anytime I see cluster, remember that's the graphic novel version. And then there is prevent the junction of the enemy's forces, know yourself and know your enemy. So prevent the junction of the enemy's forces, I put in quotes because that is an actual quotation from the Giles translation. Then I have this concept, know yourself and know your enemy, count the cost before you go to war, that information is power, so like spy on your enemy. And then there's another quote, so here's more from the actual Giles translation. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. And then something about negotiating, and I'm not sure yet, so I just use that as a placeholder, and then focus on patience and flexibility. Okay, so I've brainstormed all the things that I think might apply, and next I'm going to organize those concepts and use them to write my body paragraphs. Remember, I need 3 body paragraphs, one that uses each of 3 strategies for this concept. All right, so up at the top, I'm always going to include my thesis. This for the rest of your writing lives. Put whatever it is you're trying to say in writing at the top. So always your thesis statement or your position statement, put that at the top of whatever work you're doing, just so that you have a reminder. So my thesis is, the Cuban Missile Crisis proves that Sun Tzu's The Art of War is the definitive guidebook for succeeding in battle. Okay, so I'm going to affirm the premise that The Art of War is the definitive guidebook. So here we go. So I write this. In order to understand why The Art of War is indeed the perfect collection of strategies, the reader may begin by analyzing the initial hours of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so as I'm reading this, I notice that I have forgotten to italicize my title. Remember, titles of books, big titles always get italicized. Okay, notice too that I have created a transition. In order to understand this thesis, I'm going to first do this thing. Okay, so, and then notice at the next body paragraph, I say, having explored the first half of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the reader may now draw their attention to the final conversation that occurred between the US and Russia, which successfully ended the crisis. So notice that I have a transition into this from my thesis statement, and I have a transition from my last body paragraph into this body paragraph. So remember, as writers, what I'm trying to push on you to do now that 10th grade is halfway over is to do some of these more sophisticated techniques as opposed to the first reason why and the second reason why. I'm just pushing on you to think a little bit more deeply about that. Okay, let's go back up here. In the first many days of the conflict, the United States used Sun Tzu's strategies from The Art of War to prevent the junction of the USSR's armies. So that was one of the concepts in The Art of War. And then I explain it. A blockade was put in place to protect the United States and prevent the USSR ships from bringing weapons of mass destruction into Cuba. In the Giles translation of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Sun Tzu states, and here is my quote, and remember, by now this should be old hat for you guys. This is what it looks like to incorporate a quote into your own writing. Thus, the highest form of generalship is to prevent the junction of the enemy's forces. Okay, from Giles 15. Notice a couple of things. Here, I start with my own words. Sun Tzu states. Okay, I don't end a sentence and then start a new sentence with my quote. Notice also that I end my quotation and then I go space, parentheses, Giles 15, no comma, no page, end of parentheses, period. I will be taking off copious points at this point in the year if you aren't getting that right. So even if you write utter chaos, as long as you get that right, you're going to earn some points, okay? And even if you write something that's brilliant, if you are not doing this, you are now going to be losing points. So, fair warning. All right, because the USSR could not consolidate its power, the Americans could take advantage of the high ground and force a deal on the Soviets. By creating this deal, the United States counted the cost and considered the consequences of their possible actions. That is an indirect reference to the graphic novel, so I put that here. I didn't use quotations, but I did get that information from the cluster version, so I still have to provide an in-text citation here. The negotiations produced a better outcome than war ever would have been. By using these strategies, the United States military created a successful outcome from a bleak situation. Okay, so that's my first one, is the idea of prevent the junction of the US's forces and count the cost before you go to war. Fine. Okay, so then I move on to the next thing. Having explored the first half of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the reader may now draw their attention to the final conversation that occurred between the US and Russia, which successfully ended the crisis. In a last-ditch effort to avoid all-out war, RFK met with the Russian ambassador, and both sides showed, quote, supreme excellence, which consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Okay, couple of things here. Notice I start with a subject and a predicate, and then I introduce my quote, right? Because that creates one complete sentence. And then here, I'm adding a word to make this all smooth and relevant. And so the way to do that in writing is a hard bracket. A hard bracket just informs your reader, hey reader, I'm adding this word. It doesn't change any meaning, it just adds to the flow of the piece. Okay, resistance without fighting. Here's my in-text citation, which is perfectly done, yay. The Russian ambassador convinced RFK to remove missiles from Turkey. In essence, this broke the US's resistance and enabled Russia to benefit from a region devoid of military might. Concurrently, which means at the same time, RFK convinced the Russian ambassador to remove his missiles from Cuba. And so if you were going to finish this paragraph, what you would say is that on both sides, they broke the enemy's resistance without fighting. Both parties did that, and we avoided a nuclear holocaust as a result. So what I'm going to say is that when I conclude, the real win here is that the world stayed alive. And so the win was created by each party's efforts not to go to war in the first place. So that's what I would say. Hopefully this helps you guys to understand the flow of your piece, how you're going to use the information from your battle combined with the information you're learning from the art of war and using it to create paragraphs that are coherent and that walk your reader through your concepts so that you understand in the end that you've proven that the art of war is or is not the definitive guidebook for war. Now, in case you want to see this a little bit more closely, if you go back to your document, look, at the very bottom is everything that we just did together, okay? So that's sitting there for you to use as a model. I would, however, be cautious and careful about one thing. If your art of war facts look exactly like my art of war facts, I'm going to think that maybe you didn't read the art of war and that you are just stealing my ideas. Remember, that's plagiarism, and that's going to earn you a 0 on your essay, so be really careful about that. Also, feel free to use conceptually these ideas of how to ease in and ease out of transitions, but please be careful and cautious about using my words and not your words, okay? So the final thing you'll need to do then is to create a discussion post that informs your colleagues about what you've learned from this very screencast, okay? Have fun, happy writing, and I look forward to reading what you guys have. Thank you.